The classified document was marked "Eyes Only." Barry Goldwater stared at the intelligence briefing spread across the mahogany table in the Pentagon's secure conference room, his weathered hands gripping the papers that would reveal America's next great tragedy. It was November 15th, 1963. Just 7 days before Dallas would change everything. What he was about to learn in this room would haunt him for the rest of his life. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories that shaped America, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And tell me in the comments, do you think Goldwater was right about Vietnam? Let's dive into this untold chapter of history. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Goldwater surveyed the faces around him. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara sat rigid in his chair, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the harsh light. Across from him, General Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, shuffled through classified photographs from Saigon. And at the head of the table, McGeorge Bundy, Kennedy's national security advisor, wore the expression of a man who believed he held the future in his hands. "Senator Goldwater," Bundy began, his voice carrying that particular blend of Harvard confidence and Washington pragmatism. "What you're about to hear doesn't leave this room. The president requested your presence because, despite our political differences, he values your perspective on matters of national security." Goldwater nodded curtly. Even in 1963, even as the conservative standard-bearer who would soon challenge the Kennedy legacy, he understood the weight of genuine state secrets. The Arizona senator had built his reputation on unwavering principles, but he had never confused ideology with patriotism. When America's security was at stake, partisan politics stopped at the conference room door. McNamara cleared his throat and opened the first folder. "The situation in South Vietnam is deteriorating." He spoke with the measured cadence of a man accustomed to delivering bad news to powerful people. "Our intelligence indicates that the Viet Cong insurgency has grown beyond our initial estimates. What we thought was a manageable communist uprising has evolved into something far more complex." The defense secretary spread a map across the table. Red pins marked Viet Cong strongholds, blue pins represented South Vietnamese government forces, and green pins showed American advisory positions. The red pins outnumbered everything else by a disturbing margin. "Our advisors in country report that the South Vietnamese army lacks both the training and the motivation to effectively counter the insurgency," McNamara continued. "President Diem's government has lost the confidence of significant portions of the rural population. The strategic Hamlet program has failed to isolate the Viet Cong from civilian support." Goldwater studied the map, his pilot's eye instinctively analyzing terrain and strategic positions. He had flown bombers over the Pacific during World War II, and he recognized the tactical challenges that mountains and jungle presented. But more than that, he recognized something else, the familiar pattern of American involvement in a conflict that no one fully understood. General Taylor leaned forward. "Senator, we've increased our advisory presence from 700 men to over 16,000 in the past 2 years. Despite this commitment, the situation continues to deteriorate. The president faces a decision about whether to escalate our involvement or seek alternative strategies." "Alternative strategies?" Goldwater's voice carried a skeptical edge. "General, in my experience, there are only 2 ways to fight a war: win it or don't fight it at all. What exactly are we trying to accomplish in South Vietnam?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Bundy exchanged glances with McNamara before responding. "Our objective is to prevent the spread of communist influence in Southeast Asia. The domino theory suggests that if South Vietnam falls to communism, the rest of the region will follow Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, perhaps even the Philippines." Goldwater leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming silently on the table. He had heard the domino theory before, had even supported it in principle. But something about the briefing materials troubled him. The intelligence reports painted a picture of an enemy that understood the local terrain, enjoyed popular support in key regions, and possessed an ideological commitment that went far beyond simple communist expansion. "Mr. Bundy," Goldwater said slowly, "I've read similar assessments about other conflicts. Korea, for instance. We went into Korea with limited objectives and found ourselves fighting a war we couldn't win and couldn't afford to lose. Are we walking into the same trap in Vietnam? The National Security Advisor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Senator, the situations are quite different. In Korea, we faced a conventional invasion across an established border. Vietnam presents a different challenge, an insurgency supported by external communist powers, but rooted in local political dynamics. That makes it worse, not better, Goldwater replied. His voice remained calm, but those who knew him recognized the undertone of conviction that preceded his most forceful arguments. In Korea, at least we knew who we were fighting and what victory looked like. In Vietnam, we're proposing to take sides in what amounts to a civil war in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map against an enemy that blends into the civilian population. McNamara interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. Senator, with respect, the president needs practical advice, not philosophical objections. We have commitments to the South Vietnamese government. We have credibility issues throughout the free world. We cannot simply abandon our allies because the situation is complex. Complex? Goldwater's Arizona drawl sharpened slightly. Mr. Secretary, I've spent my life in the desert, and I've learned something important about quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. Sometimes the wise choice is not to step in it in the first place. The metaphor struck the room like a physical blow. General Taylor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As a career military officer, he understood the implications of Goldwater's comparison better than the civilian advisors. Wars had a logic of their own, and once that logic took hold, it became nearly impossible to escape its demands. Bundy attempted to regain control of the conversation. Senator, surely you're not suggesting that America should retreat from its global responsibilities? The communist threat is real, and our response must be proportional to the challenge. I'm suggesting that our global responsibilities include not committing American blood and treasure to conflicts we cannot win. Goldwater responded, and from what I see in these briefings, we're preparing to fight the wrong kind of war against the wrong kind of enemy in the wrong kind of place. The Arizona senator stood and walked to the window, though the heavy curtains prevented any view of the outside world. Behind him, the three men who shaped American foreign policy waited for his next words. They had called him here seeking conservative support for escalation, but they were receiving something entirely different, a warning they were not prepared to hear. Gentlemen, Goldwater continued, still facing the window, I've read the casualty projections. I've studied the terrain assessments. I've reviewed the intelligence on North Vietnamese capabilities. Do any of you honestly believe we can achieve our objectives without deploying hundreds of thousands of American troops to fight a ground war in Southeast Asian jungles? The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, McNamara spoke. Our current planning envisions a limited commitment designed to strengthen South Vietnamese capabilities while demonstrating American resolve. Goldwater turned from the window, his expression grim. Mr. Secretary, that's not an answer to my question. That's a bureaucratic evasion. I asked whether you believe we can win this war without a massive commitment of American forces. McNamara's composure cracked slightly. Senator, warfare involves uncertainties. We believe our strategy can succeed, but we cannot guarantee outcomes in any military conflict. Then let me be more direct, Goldwater said, returning to his seat. Are you prepared to recommend to President Kennedy that he commit 100,000 American troops to fight in Vietnam? 200,000? More? The question struck at the heart of the administration's dilemma. They wanted to prevent communist expansion without paying the full price of prevention. They sought victory without acknowledging what victory would require. In the fluorescent-lit conference room, surrounded by classified maps and intelligence assessments, the contradiction could no longer be hidden. General Taylor broke the uncomfortable silence. Senator, our military assessment suggests that with proper strategy and adequate resources, we can achieve our objectives without the massive deployment you describe. General, Goldwater replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had seen combat, I've read your military assessment. It assumes that South Vietnamese forces will dramatically improve their performance, that the Viet Cong will fail to adapt to our tactics, and that North Vietnam will limit its support for the insurgency. Those are not strategic calculations, those are wishes. The meeting had taken an unexpected turn. The administration officials had expected to brief a conservative senator on the communist threat and receive predictable support for a strong response. Instead, they found themselves defending their strategy against challenges that cut to its fundamental assumptions. Bundy attempted a different approach. Senator, what would you recommend? That we abandon South Vietnam to communist aggression? That we ignore our commitments to democratic allies throughout the region? Goldwater considered the question carefully. Outside the conference room, the vast machinery of the American government continued its daily operations. Unaware that the future of American foreign policy was being debated in this secure facility. Across the Potomac, President Kennedy was likely receiving other briefings, making other decisions that would shape the world his successors would inherit. Mr. Bundy, Goldwater finally replied, I would recommend honesty. If the president believes that preventing communist control of South Vietnam is vital to American security, then he should ask Congress for a declaration of war and commit whatever forces are necessary to win decisively. If he cannot make that case to the American people, then he should find a face-saving way to disengage before we're in so deep that disengagement becomes impossible. The response clearly frustrated the administration officials. They wanted tactical support, not strategic ultimatums. They sought congressional backing for a limited engagement, not a debate about fundamental war aims. In their view, Goldwater was offering impossible choices when the situation demanded practical compromise. McNamara leaned forward, his voice taking on a harder edge. Senator, you're presenting false alternatives. Modern warfare doesn't always require the total commitments you describe. Korea demonstrated that limited wars for limited objectives can achieve American goals without unlimited escalation. Did Korea achieve American goals? Goldwater shot back. We prevented communist conquest of South Korea, but at what cost? 54,000 American dead, a permanent military commitment that continues to this day, and a divided peninsula that remains a potential flashpoint for World War III. Is that the model you want to replicate in Vietnam? The comparison to Korea hit home because it highlighted the administration's deepest fear that Vietnam would become another Korea, but potentially worse. The Korean conflict had at least enjoyed the legitimacy of a United Nations mandate and clear aggression across an established border. Vietnam presented murkier justifications and more complex political dynamics. General Taylor attempted to distinguish the situations. Senator, the strategic importance of Southeast Asia differs significantly from Korea. The region contains crucial shipping lanes, important raw materials, and allies whose confidence in American commitments affects our position throughout Asia. General, Goldwater replied, I don't dispute the region's strategic importance. I question whether our current approach serves our strategic interests. Are we strengthening American influence in Asia by associating ourselves with an unpopular government in Saigon? Are we demonstrating resolve or desperation by gradually escalating our involvement without clear objectives? The question struck at the administration's central vulnerability. They had inherited a limited commitment to South Vietnam from the Eisenhower administration and had gradually expanded that commitment without clearly defining its ultimate goals. Each escalation had been presented as necessary to protect previous investments, creating a logic of involvement that had acquired its own momentum. Bundy made one final attempt to gain Goldwater's support. Senator, regardless of how we reach this point, we face current realities. The communist threat in Southeast Asia exists. South Vietnamese forces need American support. Our allies throughout the region are watching to see whether America honors its commitments. What practical choice do we have except to do what we can with available resources? Goldwater was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces around the table. These were intelligent, dedicated men who genuinely believed they were serving American interests. But they were also men trapped by their own assumptions, unable to acknowledge that their strategy might be fundamentally flawed. "Mr. Bundy," he finally said, "you ask what practical choice we have. Let me suggest that the most practical choice might be the most difficult one, admitting that we made a mistake in assuming we could achieve our objectives in South Vietnam without costs we're unwilling to pay." The words hung in the air like an accusation. For administration officials who had built their careers on the assumption that American power could solve any problem with sufficient application, Goldwater's suggestion represented more than strategic disagreement. It challenged their most basic beliefs about America's role in the world. McNamara's response came quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Senator, American leadership of the free world depends on our willingness to meet challenges wherever they arise. Retreat from Vietnam would signal weakness to our enemies and uncertainty to our allies." "Mr. Secretary," Goldwater replied, "sometimes the strongest thing a great power can do is acknowledge its limitations. The Soviet Union learned that lesson in their relations with Yugoslavia and Poland. Perhaps it's time America learned it in relation to Vietnam." The reference to Soviet limitations struck an unexpected chord. The administration had watched with satisfaction as communist solidarity cracked under the pressure of national interests and ideological differences. But they had not considered that American power might face similar limitations when confronted with local dynamics it could not control. General Taylor shifted uncomfortably. "Senator, military history suggests that determined powers can overcome local challenges with appropriate strategies and sufficient resources. The British Empire maintained global commitments for centuries by adapting tactics to local conditions. General," Goldwater responded, "military history also suggests that empires decline when they commit resources to conflicts they cannot win in places they do not understand for reasons they cannot clearly explain. The British learned that lesson in Ireland, in Afghanistan, and eventually throughout their empire." The comparison to imperial decline clearly troubled the administration officials. They had not entered government to manage American retreat, but to extend American influence. The suggestion that Vietnam might represent imperial overstretch rather than necessary commitment challenged their fundamental understanding of their mission. As the meeting stretched into its third hour, the fundamental disagreement had become clear. The administration sought tactical flexibility within a strategy of gradual escalation. Goldwater demanded strategic clarity before any further commitment. Neither side was prepared to accept the other's framework for decision-making. Bundy attempted a final compromise. "Senator, perhaps we can agree that the current situation requires careful monitoring and measured responses. We're not committed to any particular level of escalation, but we cannot abandon our allies without serious consideration of the consequences." Goldwater recognized the language of bureaucratic evasion. "Mr. Bundy, I've spent enough time in Washington to know what careful monitoring and measured responses means. It means gradual escalation without acknowledgement of where that escalation leads. It means doing more of what hasn't worked in the hope that somehow it will start working." The Arizona senator gathered his notes and prepared to leave. "Gentlemen, I came here hoping to learn that you had a strategy for victory or a plan for disengagement. Instead, I've learned that you have a strategy for deeper involvement without consideration of ultimate costs. I cannot support that approach." As Goldwater stood to leave, McNamara made one final appeal. "Senator, the President values your counsel. If you cannot support our current approach, what would you recommend he tell the American people about our commitment to South Vietnam?" Goldwater paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "I would recommend he tell them the truth, that we face choices we'd prefer not to make, that our options are more limited than we'd like to admit, and that sometimes the most patriotic thing a leader can do is refuse to lead his country into a disaster he can see coming." The meeting ended without resolution. As Goldwater walked down the Pentagon's sterile corridors toward his waiting car, he carried with him the weight of knowledge he could not share. In 7 days, President Kennedy would be dead, and the Vietnam decisions would fall to Lyndon Johnson. The Arizona senator wondered whether his warnings would die with Kennedy or whether they might somehow influence the choices that lay ahead. But deep in his heart, Barry Goldwater already knew the answer. The logic of involvement had taken hold, and American policymakers would follow that logic wherever it led. His warnings would be ignored, his alternatives dismissed, and his predictions fulfilled in ways that would haunt America for decades to come. The classified briefing that November afternoon represented more than a policy disagreement. It revealed the gap between what American leaders believed about their country's power and what that power could actually accomplish. In the fluorescent-lit conference room, where the future was debated but not decided, Barry Goldwater had seen clearly what others could not yet acknowledge: that America was about to step into quicksand, and the more it struggled, the deeper it would sink. Years later, as American casualties mounted and public support eroded, Goldwater would remember that November afternoon when he had tried to warn them. He had seen it coming not because he possessed superior wisdom, but because he had been willing to ask the hard questions that revealed uncomfortable truths. In a city that ran on optimism and ambition, he had offered realism and restraint. In a moment that demanded courage, he had provided the most difficult kind of courage, the courage to say no. The Pentagon meeting of November 15th, 1963, became a footnote to larger events. But for those who understood the weight of the decisions being made, it represented something more significant, a moment when American power confronted its limitations and chose not to acknowledge them. The consequences of that choice would define a generation, reshape American politics, and challenge every assumption about what America could accomplish in a world that did not always bend to American will. Barry Goldwater drove back to Capitol Hill that afternoon, carrying secrets he could never share and warnings that would never be heeded. In less than a year, he would accept his party's nomination for president and face the voters with a message of conservative principles and military strength. But he would also carry with him the knowledge of what those principles meant when tested against the realities of power, and the memory of an afternoon when he had tried to save his country from a tragedy he could see coming. The fluorescent lights in the Pentagon conference room had revealed more than classified documents and strategic assessments. They had illuminated the gap between what powerful people wanted to believe and what they were willing to acknowledge. In that gap, American policy was made, American lives were committed, and American history took a turn that would define the next decade. Barry Goldwater had seen it clearly, had spoken honestly about what he saw, and had learned the hardest lesson Washington had to teach: that being right about the future meant nothing if no one was willing to listen.